Order. The question is, that this bill be now read a second time? I call the honourable member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And what an extraordinary presentation from a woman of all people. And I'll go into some of those absurdities that were just espoused. Notions like, would it be terrible if a woman who was getting full paid parental leave took her other child, perhaps a toddler, out of the creche or childcare centre? That would be terrible for the business of the childcare centre. How extraordinary. Wouldn't it be better for that woman to be able to have both her children at home in a period of paid parental leave? So I think we need a lot of heavy thinking about how we have such an extraordinary representation from the Labor Party to try and defend what was a very mean paid parental leave introduced where there was no superannuation consideration. Don't they understand that women are most likely to be in poverty in their older age because they've had gaps in their employment while they went away to bear their children? That superannuation continuously is critical for women to be able to remain independent in their older age. And here we have a Labor government at the time saying, no, women don't need super, men do, but not women, and therefore their very mean, cheapskate paid parental leave paid only the minimum wage to all women, even those who were already receiving much higher returns in paid parental leave because they're in the public service or in defence forces or in the insurance or banking sector. Apparently it was going to be somehow enough for women, all women, to be only paid the equivalent of the minimum wage, no superannuation, and for a very miserable 18 weeks. It was one of the most shameful pieces of Labor Party policy, and I remember the poor unions hiding their heads in shame, particularly those giants of women amongst the Labor Union who'd fought for years for a paid parental scheme. In corners in Parliament House saying, how are we going to defend this? What can we do? Perhaps it's best if we say nothing and hope that they'll fix it as fast as possible. Well, the good news is the coalition has fixed the problem of cheapskate, inadequate paid parental leave that Labor gave us. And I have to say that while this amendment is in its sense purely administrative and not much to do with the overall policy, I'll deal with it straight away. I think it is very important to remind ourselves that for a woman to expect to have her full salary paid when she leaves the workforce, to have a child, and to then be accused of somehow being grafting, asking for too much, expecting something gold-plated, when that is exactly what a man expects and gets if he takes recreational leave, sick leave, long service leave. Why should a woman who is bringing forward the new generation of Australian be expected to accept much less as an industrial standard than what has been enjoyed by the general population, the workforce, most of this century? And certainly, I'd have to say, since the 1970s. So this is an extraordinary situation where we see the Labor Party, who likes to beat its chest and say, oh, it's all for workers and it's all for women. When you look at the reality of their policies, it's actually the reverse. It is actually the reverse. They do everything they can to make sure that the oppressed and underpaid continue in that circumstance. And so we had this extraordinary action to when the Prime Minister announced that there would be your full income replacement paid to you for 6 months for paid parental leave, not the miserable minimal wage for just 3 months. And the scream from the Labor sisterhood went up. I've found it extraordinary. And this presentation we've just had from the other side of the chamber just reinforces how low some of them can go in abandoning their women who are members of their party and expected a lot more, a lot better. Now, this particular amendment just deals with the administrative burden on business, where the paid parental leave legislation required them as bigger businesses to pay the parental leave fund themselves, to administer it themselves. So from the 1st of July 2014, employees will be paid directly by the Department of Human Services unless an employer opts in to provide parental leave paid to its employees and an employee agrees for their employer to pay them. Now, the previous speaker became quite excited about the fact that the numbers were wrong. I think that's quite irrelevant. The point is that if you can have the minimum of additional red tape and administrative burden on our small and larger businesses, isn't that a good thing? That has to be a good thing. And Centrelink is set up with its computer-aided systems to be able to deal with this payment in an efficient and effective way, and I say, what a good idea. Unfortunately, under Labor, there was that much red tape and additional burden of administration that numbers of our small businesses literally went under. They couldn't cope with the form filling, the duplicated rubbish that was requested of them day after day, in particular in the aged care sector, where women who'd entered that workforce wanting to use their skills of empathy and care in their relations every day with their elderly residents instead found themselves filling in forms, more and more and more paperwork. Often they weren't of English-speaking backgrounds, so we had great carers leaving the aged care workforce because Labor killed them with their burden of red tape. Well, we're not going to perpetuate that nonsense, and you'll be aware, Deputy Speaker, that one of our main aims in this government is to slash the administrative burden, the rubbish red tape that was added to the legislation under Labor's watch. Now let's get back to paid parental leave itself. I find it extraordinary. I think most of us have received these emails. Perhaps it's mostly women members who do, but we get these emails, sadly, from older women saying, I didn't get paid parental leave, I coped, why can't they? This is really silly. Well, I say to those women, good on you, but you didn't have electricity in the 1950s either, and maybe you didn't have a telephone in those early days, and we don't simply say you didn't have it, so, you know, in the 21st century, the rest of the human population can't. I think that's a nonsense argument, but you get it fairly regularly in the emails. I find, though, when I ring these older women and talk to them for, only a couple of minutes, they soon start to tell me about their granddaughters and the difficulties they have in trying to work full-time, because they need two incomes to keep their mortgage payments up, to pay for their car, to pay for their kids' school fees perhaps. They need those two incomes, and how they feel sorry for the burdens that working women now often have to bear, where they are trying to do it all. Have the babies, raise the children, look after the disabled, look after elderly parents and parents-in-law, and still have a career that is fulfilling and where they can reach their full potential. So often those conversations with older women usually end up with us all in furious agreement that yes, paid parental leave is not only important, it's necessary for women in the 21st century. And I was amazed at the previous Labor speaker saying, oh, she's been out consulting, or someone in the Labor Party has been out consulting, and women have said no, they'd rather focus on childcare and superannuation. Well, I can understand the superannuation issue because they refuse to give super to their women taking parental leave. But to suggest in their consultations, I imagine that was a bit of a furphy, perhaps nothing's happened at all, but to suggest that women out there are saying we want childcare sorted, not paid parental leave, is absolutely rubbish. What women say to me, including my two daughters who between them have 6 children, they say we need both. We've got to have efficient, cost-effective, adequate, flexible childcare, but we also have to have, when we have our babies, adequate time off, at least 6 months, on our replacement salaries, so we can bond with our babies, so we can breastfeed our babies, so we can have our younger siblings out of childcare for that 6 months' time, so we can form a proper family when those newborns come into the household. And of course, you can also have a father participate in this paid parental scheme if they wish. Now, I just find it absurd to have this argument where you either, as Labor is suggesting, support childcare or you give mothers adequate paid parental leave. What a rubbish argument. Would you ever have that when it comes to suggesting that men in the workforce can either have full pay for sick leave or they can trade off their long service leave? It just wouldn't happen. So why is it that women are supposed to cop all of this? I have to say that Australia, and I'm not proud about this, but Australia was one of the last countries in the OECD, along with the United States of America, to have a statutory paid parental leave system. It was a very long time in coming in Australia. But lest you think we had all these poor women having their babies and going back to work the next day, that in fact wasn't the case, because the private sector and the public service moved in to fill the gap that was there because we didn't have a statutory paid parental leave scheme. But what we had before Labor introduced its mean and lousy no superannuation, only 3-month scheme, what we had were the women lucky enough to be in the public service being offered paid parental leave at full pay. Likewise, if you're in the Defence Forces, in any higher paid position, our women in the workforce were offered full pay replacement in their paid parental leave. It was just bad luck, according to Labor, that if you were a part-time worker or in a lower paid industry like accommodation, cafes and restaurants or retail, you just missed out, and that was just tough. I'll give you the statistics. In 2005, 76% of women employed in the public sector in their last main job while pregnant used full pay paid maternity leave, compared with just 27% of women employees in the private sector overall. 80% of women whose last main job while pregnant was in government administration and defence, and 68% of those who were in education used full pay paid maternity leave. There was also much higher levels in finance and insurance industry. However, I've just referred to this, the industries with the lowest proportion of female employees paid any maternity leave entitlements at all were accommodation, cafes and restaurants. Only 14% got paid parental leave, and in retail 21%. Now, instead of Labor looking at those statistics and saying, that's not fair, those poorer paid women, those part-time women, should have had decent paid parental leave as well. Instead of looking at that inequity, what they did was have every woman in the workforce reduced to a minimum wage for only 3 months as a paid parental leave entitlement. How extraordinary. And no superannuation. No wonder those union women hung their head in shame, hoped it would very quickly morph into a better scheme. Sadly, it didn't, as I say, and it was up to Coalition to put a decent scheme on the table. So we now have a scheme, the paid parental leave scheme under the Coalition, where women, as men do in their various work entitlements, get paid the equivalent of their income, their wage, for up to 26 weeks, up to a woman earning $100,000. I am very sad to say only about 2% of the Australian women workforce do earn more than $100,000. But at least up to that level, women will be paid a full replacement salary. They will also receive their superannuation. So they're not going to have this gap, this stop-start business that Labor was more than happy to endorse. They're going to have a better chance of having an independent older age. The reality for women in Australia is they're more likely to be alone in older age, either through divorce or being widowed or never having married. Because fewer women now are marrying in Australia or permanently partnering, we know at least 30% of women over 30 now will not be marrying. There'll be more who will need to be able to independently pay for their old age. And we know women are going to have a long older age after retirement into the future. A young girl born today will probably on average live to 100 years. So for Labor to have been happy with denying women superannuation payments while they were taking leave to nurture their newborn, I find that disgusting. I find it unconscionable. And I don't know how women of the Labor Party can sit in this chamber and make speeches saying it was all okay. And I don't know how they can just get excited about the whether or not the figures of the comparison of the cost-benefit analysis or whatever, whether they all add up. I'm sure they do. But I'm amazed that that's the focus of their attention, not the fact that under Labor's scheme, you in fact do not get your full wage, even though your mortgage reflects the full wage that you've been receiving along with your partner, and you certainly only get 18 weeks, and you don't get access to super. What an extraordinary scheme for a country like Australia, which happens to take some pride in the idea of equity and a fair go. So I, of course, strongly support this amendment. And I also ask all of those out there who keep sending me emails or suggesting to me how dare a woman want full pay when she takes a parental leave, how dare they consider getting superannuation. I'd like them to stop and think about the incredible sacrifices women do make when they choose to have a child during their career. To think about the extra work they take on raising children, managing a career, looking after their partners and lots of others in the community as well. I salute Women of Australia. I think they do a magnificent job. And I really want to see our coalition pay parental leave start as soon as possible. Thank you.